I never thought I'd be face down on hot asphalt with 50,000 volts still buzzing through my nervous system. But here we are. The taste of blood mixed with pavement grit filled my mouth as I tried to remember where the hell I was and why everything hurt like I'd been hit by a freight train. The ringing in my ears was so loud I almost missed the cop's voice above me, all authority and zero compassion. "Stay down, asshole! You move again and you're getting another ride on the Lightning." My name is Marcus Rodriguez, and I'm 43 years old. 3 tours in Afghanistan with the 75th Ranger Regiment, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Bronze Star with V device that's collecting dust in a shoebox somewhere. These days, I work the graveyard shift at a warehouse in Riverside, California, loading trucks for $8.50 an hour and trying to keep my head above water. The job doesn't pay much, but it keeps me busy during the hours when the nightmares like to visit most. What happened that Tuesday morning started like any other bad day. I'd clocked out at 6 a.m. after another sleepless shift, my back screaming from lifting boxes that seemed to get heavier every week. The plan was simple: grab some coffee and groceries, maybe catch a few hours of sleep before my daughter Emma's soccer practice. She's 12 now, and watching her play is about the only thing that makes sense in my world anymore. The morning was already heating up as I walked through the Walgreens parking lot, my old Tacoma sitting lonely in the far corner where I always park it. Force of habit, I guess. Always leave yourself an exit route. Always keep your 6 covered. Some things you never unlearn, even when you're buying toothpaste instead of hunting Taliban. I was fishing for my keys when the sound hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. Crack, crack, crack. 3 sharp reports echoing off the buildings around me, and suddenly I wasn't in California anymore. I was back in the mountains outside Kandahar, and my squad was taking fire from a building we'd cleared twice already. The smell of cordite and burning diesel filled my nostrils, even though I knew it wasn't real. My heart hammered against my ribs like it was trying to escape, and my hands started shaking so bad I dropped my keys. The rational part of my brain knew it was just a car backfiring in the distance, maybe some kid's souped-up Honda spitting and popping as he rolled through the parking lot. But rationality doesn't mean shit when your nervous system thinks you're back in a war zone. The adrenaline dump hit me like a tsunami, and I went straight into combat mode. I dropped behind my truck, back pressed against the rear tire, scanning for threats that existed only in my fractured memory. My breathing came in short, sharp gasps, and sweat started pouring down my face despite the morning chill. This was a bad one, worse than I'd had in months. Usually I could talk myself down, remind myself where I was, what year it was, but this episode had claws, and it wasn't letting go. That's when Officer Blake Richardson decided to get involved. I heard his boots on the asphalt before I saw him, heavy and confident, the kind of walk that says, "I'm in charge here and don't you forget it." He was probably in his late 30s, built like he spent serious time in the gym, with the kind of mustache that belonged in a 1980s cop movie. His uniform was crisp, his gear perfectly arranged, and his hand was already resting on his service weapon when he rounded the corner of my truck. "Sir, I need you to stand up slowly and show me your hands." I tried to explain, but the words came out all wrong, tangled up with hyperventilation and panic. It's not... Just give me a minute, okay? I'm having an episode." "I don't know what kind of episode you're talking about, but I need you to comply with my instructions. Stand up. Now!" The command voice cut right through me, the same tone drill sergeants had used back in basic, except this wasn't basic and I wasn't some green recruit who needed to be broken down and rebuilt. I was a man having the worst kind of flashback in a Walgreens parking lot, and this cop was treating me like a criminal. "Officer, please," I managed, still crouched behind my truck. "I'm a veteran. I'm having a PTSD episode. If you could just give me a minute to get grounded." "I don't care if you're the fucking Easter Bunny. You're acting erratic and I have reports of a disturbance. Get up or I'll make you get up." That's when everything went sideways. In my fractured state, the aggressive commands triggered something deep and primal. My training kicked in, the same training that had kept me alive through 3 deployments, and suddenly Officer Richardson wasn't a cop anymore. He was a threat. An enemy combatant who needed to be neutralized. I shot up from behind the truck faster than a man my age should be able to move, muscle memory taking over from conscious thought. Richardson went for his taser, but I was already moving, closing the distance between us with the kind of speed and precision that only comes from years of close-quarters combat training. "Get back! Get the fuck back!" he screamed, fumbling with his weapon. But I wasn't hearing him anymore. I was hearing the distinctive whistle of incoming mortars, the crack of AK-47 fire, the screams of wounded Rangers calling for medic. In my mind, I was saving my squad. In reality, I was terrifying a small-town cop who probably thought the scariest thing he'd faced that morning was a drunk driver. Richardson got the taser deployed just as I reached him. The twin probes caught me center mass, and 50,000 volts dropped me like a sack of concrete. Every muscle in my body locked up as electricity coursed through my nervous system, and I hit the ground hard enough to split my lip and bloody my nose. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but weirdly, it also cut right through the PTSD episode. Nothing grounds you in the present quite like being electrocuted. "Subject is down! Subject is down!" Richardson was shouting into his radio, adrenaline making his voice crack. "I need backup at the Walgreens on University. Suspect was charging me, had to deploy taser." Suspect. That's what I'd become in the span of 30 seconds. From a guy buying groceries to a suspect on the ground, bleeding and twitching while a cop stood over me like he'd just bagged a trophy buck. More sirens started wailing in the distance, getting closer. Richardson kept his weapon trained on me while he waited for backup, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "Don't even think about moving, asshole. You try that shit again and next time it's bullets, not electricity." The backup arrived in force. 3 more patrol cars, an ambulance, and a fire truck, because apparently subduing one middle-aged veteran requires half the emergency services in Riverside County. Officers poured out of their vehicles like it was the final scene in a bank robbery movie, all tactical positions and shouted commands. "What have we got, Blake?" asked a sergeant with gray hair and tired eyes. "Erratic subject, possibly on drugs. He came at me aggressive, had to tase him. Could be homeless, looks like he hasn't seen a shower in days." Homeless. The word stung worse than the lingering effects of the taser. Yeah, I'd been working graveyard shifts and sleeping in my truck some nights when the apartment got too expensive, but I wasn't some vagrant causing trouble. I was just a guy having the worst kind of day, and now I was being treated like public enemy number 1. They cuffed me with my hands behind my back, the metal cutting into my wrists as I lay there bleeding onto the parking lot. The paramedics checked me over with the kind of professional detachment that made it clear they'd seen this routine before. Another crazy vet losing his shit in public, another Tuesday morning in paradise. "Vitals are stable," one of them reported. "Some minor lacerations from the fall, but nothing serious. Pupils are dilated, could be under the influence." Under the influence. Of course. Because the only explanation for a guy acting strange had to be drugs, right? Couldn't possibly be that he'd spent 3 years dodging IEDs and watching friends come home in flag-draped boxes. Couldn't be that some mornings the difference between Afghanistan and California gets a little blurry around the edges. They loaded me into the back of Richardson's cruiser, and I got my first good look at the cop who'd just lit me up like a Christmas tree. He was filling out paperwork on the hood of his car, probably describing how he'd heroically subdued a dangerous vagrant threatening public safety. His body camera was still recording, that little red light blinking away like a mechanical witness to the whole sorry mess. "You got anything to say for yourself?" Richardson asked as he slid into the driver's seat. "Any reason I shouldn't take you downtown and let you sleep this off in a cell?" I thought about telling him about Kandahar province, about the IED that took out half my squad and left me with traumatic brain injury and PTSD so severe that some days I can't remember my own daughter's middle name. I thought about explaining how certain sounds can transport me back to the worst day of my life, how I'd been managing my condition for years without hurting anyone until this morning went straight to hell. Instead, I just said, "I'm sorry, officer. I was having a medical episode. I never meant to scare you." Medical episode. He snorted like I'd just told him I was late for tea with the Queen. Right. Save it for the judge, pal. The ride to the station gave me time to think, and thinking was the last thing I wanted to do. Emma was going to find out about this. My ex-wife Sarah would use it as ammunition in our ongoing custody battle. My boss at the warehouse would probably fire me before I made bail. 3 tours in Afghanistan, and I was going to lose everything because of a car backfiring in a parking lot. They processed me like any other drunk and disorderly, fingerprints and mugshots, and a holding cell that smelled like piss and despair. Richardson's report painted me as an aggressive vagrant who'd attacked a police officer without provocation. No mention of PTSD, no mention of my veteran status, just another dangerous individual removed from the streets for the safety of law-abiding citizens. I used my one phone call to contact my public defender, a overworked woman named Janet Kowalski, who sounded like she was eating lunch while we talked. She promised to look into getting me released on my own recognizance, but warned me that assaulting a police officer was serious business. Even if Richardson had exaggerated the threat level, even if I was having a medical episode, the law didn't make exceptions for good intentions gone wrong. Best case scenario, we plead this down to disturbing the peace, she said between bites of what sounded like a sandwich. Worst case, you're looking at 6 months in county and a permanent record. Depends on whether the officer wants to be reasonable or make an example. I spent 2 days in county lockup before making bail, 2 days of sharing space with actual criminals who couldn't understand why a guy who'd served his country was getting treated like a terrorist. The other inmates were mostly decent people who'd made bad choices or gotten caught up in circumstances beyond their control, but the guards treated us all like animals in cages. When I finally got out, the damage was already spreading. Someone had posted cell phone video of the incident online. Grainy footage of me getting tased and arrested in the Walgreens parking lot with a caption that read, "Crazy homeless guy attacks cop, gets what he deserves." The comment section was exactly what you'd expect from the internet's finest minds, full of people calling me a druggie and a bum who should have been shot instead of tased. My boss at the warehouse was waiting for me when I showed up for my next shift, termination papers already filled out. "Nothing personal, Marcus," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Company policy about criminal charges. Can't have that kind of liability on the payroll." Sarah's lawyer called that afternoon to inform me that my arrest had created concerns about my fitness as a parent and that they'd be filing for emergency custody modification. Emma's weekend visits were suspended pending a psychological evaluation that I couldn't afford. Everything I'd been holding together with duct tape and determination was falling apart, and I couldn't see a way to stop it. The worst part was the looks I got around town. Riverside isn't that big, and word travels fast when a local vet gets tased by police. People who'd known me for years suddenly crossed the street when they saw me coming. Parents pulled their kids a little closer when I walked by. I'd gone from being just another guy trying to make it through the day to being the crazy veteran everyone whispered about. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in early October. I showed up in my only decent suit, the same one I'd worn to job interviews and Emma's school plays, and tried to look like something other than the dangerous criminal Richardson's report had painted me as. The courtroom was nearly empty, except for the usual collection of public defenders, prosecutors, and defendants cycling through the system. Richardson took the stand first, his testimony delivered with the kind of practiced confidence that comes from doing this dance dozens of times before. He described a dangerous individual exhibiting erratic behavior, making threatening gestures, and charging at him with clear intent to cause harm. He spoke about fearing for his safety and the safety of nearby civilians, about having no choice but to use force to neutralize the threat. In my professional opinion, Your Honor, the defendant was either under the influence of controlled substances or suffering from some form of mental illness that made him a clear and present danger to public safety, Richardson concluded. I did what any reasonable officer would do in that situation. My public defender did her best, but what could she really say? The facts were the facts. I'd charged at a police officer, he'd used his taser to stop me, and I'd been arrested for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. The PTSD angle might generate some sympathy, but it didn't change what had happened. Mental illness wasn't a get-out-of-jail-free card, especially when it resulted in aggressive behavior toward law enforcement. Judge Patricia Hernandez listened to both sides with the kind of weary patience that suggested she'd heard every sob story and excuse in the book. She was a stern woman in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and reading glasses that made her look like a disappointed librarian. When the testimony concluded, she set bail at $5,000 and scheduled a trial date for early November. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, looking down at me over those glasses, "I strongly recommend you seek treatment for whatever underlying issues contributed to this incident. The court is sympathetic to the challenges faced by our veterans, but that sympathy has limits when public safety is involved." The next few weeks were the longest of my life. I was staying in a fleabag motel on the outskirts of town, paying by the week and watching my savings evaporate like morning dew. Emma's visits were still suspended, which meant the only thing keeping me sane was being taken away just when I needed it most. I'd call her every night before bed, trying to explain why Daddy couldn't see her right now without going into details that would give her nightmares. "It's okay, Daddy," she told me one night, her voice small and worried through the phone. "Mommy says you're sick and need to get better. I drew you a picture of us playing soccer when you're not sick anymore." I cried myself to sleep that night, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. This 12-year-old kid was being more understanding and mature than most of the adults in my life, and I was letting her down in ways that would probably leave scars for years to come. The trial prep meetings with Janet Kowalski weren't exactly filling me with confidence. She was a decent enough lawyer, but she was handling about 40 cases simultaneously and couldn't dedicate the time needed to really understand what had happened that morning. Her strategy seemed to be hoping Richardson would show some mercy and agree to a plea deal that kept me out of prison. "Look, Marcus," she said during one of our brief consultations, "your military service definitely helps, and the PTSD angle might generate some sympathy with the jury. But at the end of the day, you charged at a police officer. That's not something judges and juries take lightly, especially in the current climate." I asked her about getting character witnesses, people who could testify that I wasn't some dangerous lunatic who went around attacking cops for fun. She said it might help, but warned me that the prosecution would just point to my behavior that morning as evidence that prior good conduct didn't mean anything when mental illness was involved. "The problem is perception," she explained. "A jury sees a veteran with PTSD who attacked a police officer, and they start thinking about all the news stories they've heard about combat veterans losing it and hurting people. Fair or not, that's the reality we're dealing with." The weeks dragged on, each day bringing me closer to a trial that felt more like a sentencing hearing. I'd lie awake in that crappy motel room, staring at water stains on the ceiling and wondering how everything had gone so wrong so fast. 3 years ago, I'd been a respected member of my community, a devoted father, a guy who'd served his country with honor and distinction. Now I was a cautionary tale about what happens when veterans don't get the help they need. Local news picked up the story about a week before trial, and that's when things really went to hell. Channel 7's investigative team did a segment on veteran PTSD and police interactions using my case as their primary example. They interviewed Richardson, who came across as a concerned public servant forced to deal with dangerous individuals that the system had failed to help. "It's tragic when our veterans struggle with readjustment issues," he told the reporter, managing to sound both sympathetic and slightly superior. "But our primary responsibility is public safety. When someone exhibits threatening behavior, we have to respond appropriately, regardless of their background." They also interviewed Dr. Patricia Welsh, a local psychiatrist who specialized in veteran mental health. She talked about the challenges of PTSD, the difficulties veterans faced reintegrating into civilian society, and the importance of early intervention and treatment. It was all accurate information delivered with genuine compassion, but it painted me as a ticking time bomb who'd finally exploded. Unfortunately, cases like Mr. Rodriguez's are more common than people realize, Dr. Welsh explained. Combat trauma doesn't just disappear when veterans come home. Without proper support and treatment, these individuals can become a danger to themselves and others. The story aired on a slow news day, which meant it got picked up by other outlets and started making the rounds on social media. Suddenly, my worst moment was entertainment for people eating dinner and scrolling through their phones. The comments ranged from supportive to savage, with plenty of armchair psychologists offering opinions about what should happen to unstable veterans who couldn't control themselves. My ex-wife's lawyer was all over it, filing additional paperwork to make my custody suspension permanent. Given Mr. Rodriguez's recent arrest for violent behavior and the ongoing concerns about his mental stability, it would be in the child's best interest to limit contact until he receives comprehensive psychological treatment. Emma saw the news story at a friend's house. She called me crying that night, asking if I was really dangerous like the TV said. Trying to explain PTSD to a 12-year-old is hard enough without having to do it through the filter of criminal charges and media sensationalism. "Daddy, are you going to jail?" she asked between sobs. "I don't know, sweetheart. I hope not. But even if I do, it doesn't change how much I love you, okay? None of this is your fault, and none of it changes who you are or who I am." The trial started on a cold Monday morning in November. The courthouse was busy with the usual collection of lawyers, defendants, and family members trying to navigate the justice system. I sat next to Janet Kowalski at the defendant's table, wearing my only suit and trying to look like someone who deserved a second chance rather than a prison sentence. Judge Hernandez called the case, and the prosecutor laid out his version of events with the kind of clinical precision that made everything sound worse than it was. According to the state, I was a dangerous individual with a history of mental instability who'd committed an unprovoked attack on a police officer performing his duties. The fact that I was a veteran was mentioned only as context for my underlying psychological issues. Richardson testified again, sticking to his original story about a threatening subject who'd left him no choice but to use force. He was calm and professional on the stand, answering questions with the kind of confidence that comes from being on the right side of the law. When the prosecutor asked him about my veteran status, he shrugged like it was irrelevant. "Sir, I've dealt with plenty of veterans over the years, and the vast majority are good people who would never behave this way. Mr. Rodriguez's military service doesn't excuse his actions that morning." The prosecutor called Dr. Welsh as an expert witness to testify about PTSD and its effects on behavior. She was fair and factual, explaining how combat trauma could manifest as hypervigilance, emotional dysregulation, and aggressive responses to perceived threats. But when pressed about whether PTSD could excuse criminal behavior, she was clear that it couldn't. PTSD is a serious medical condition that requires treatment and understanding, she said. But it's not a blank check for violent behavior. Many veterans successfully manage their symptoms without posing a threat to public safety. Janet's defense was straightforward. I was a decorated veteran having a medical emergency who'd been misunderstood and mistreated by an officer who should have recognized the signs of PTSD and responded with compassion rather than force. She called my former squad leader, Sergeant First Class Tony Mendoza, to testify about my character and service record. Tony drove down from Fresno to speak on my behalf, taking time off from his job at the VA to sit in a witness chair and try to save my ass. He looked good in his dress uniform, every ribbon and badge perfectly positioned, the kind of soldier who commanded respect just by walking into a room. "Marcus Rodriguez is one of the finest men I've ever served with," Tony said, his voice carrying across the courtroom with military precision. "He saved lives in Afghanistan, mine included. The man sitting at that table isn't a criminal. He's a hero who needs help, not punishment." But even Tony's testimony couldn't change the basic facts of the case. Video evidence from the parking lot security cameras showed me charging at Richardson, and body camera footage captured the entire incident from the officer's perspective. No matter how you spun it, I'd acted aggressively toward a police officer, and that's a hard thing to explain away. The prosecutor's closing argument was devastating in its simplicity. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we all respect and honor our veterans' service to this country, but respect for their sacrifice cannot blind us to the reality of their actions. Mr. Rodriguez made a choice that morning to charge at Officer Richardson, creating a dangerous situation that required immediate intervention. Mental illness may explain his behavior, but it cannot excuse it. Janet did her best in response, painting me as a victim of inadequate mental health support and a police officer who'd escalated a medical emergency into a criminal matter. She reminded the jury that I'd never been arrested before, that I'd served my country with distinction, and that I deserved compassion rather than condemnation. Marcus Rodriguez didn't wake up that morning planning to attack anyone, she argued. He had a medical emergency triggered by combat trauma, and instead of receiving the help he needed, he was treated like a criminal. This is not justice. This is a failure of the system to support those who sacrificed everything for our freedom. The jury deliberated for 3 hours before returning with a verdict. Guilty on the reduced charge of disorderly conduct, not guilty on resisting arrest. It wasn't the worst outcome, but it wasn't vindication either. Judge Hernandez sentenced me to 90 days in county jail, suspended pending completion of anger management classes and regular mental health treatment. I walked out of that courtroom a convicted criminal, even if I'd avoided prison time. The media coverage was brief but brutal. Local veteran convicted in police incident ran on page 3 of the Riverside Press Enterprise, with a sidebar about the importance of mental health services for returning combat veterans. I was a cautionary tale now, a reminder of what happens when the system fails our heroes. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't destroying my life. Emma's custody hearing was scheduled for the following week, and I already knew how it was going to go. Sarah's lawyer would point to my criminal conviction as evidence of instability, and the judge would err on the side of caution when it came to a child's safety. I might get supervised visitation if I was lucky, but the days of weekend camping trips and soccer practice were probably over for good. I was sitting in my motel room the night before the custody hearing, staring at a bottle of bourbon I'd bought but couldn't bring myself to open, when my phone started buzzing with unknown numbers. Text messages from people I didn't recognize, voicemails from reporters, and friend requests on Facebook from strangers who wanted to show support for our veterans. The first message I read made my blood run cold. Saw the news about your case. Thought you should know that body cam footage from last year is making the rounds. You might want to watch Channel 7 tonight. I turned on the TV just in time to catch the lead story on the evening news. The anchor was a serious-looking woman in her 40s, the kind of professional broadcaster who could deliver news about puppies or nuclear war with the same measured tone. Good evening. Tonight, a stunning development in the case of Army Ranger veteran Marcus Rodriguez, who was convicted last week of disorderly conduct after an incident with Riverside Police. New body camera footage has surfaced showing Rodriguez in a very different light, and the implications are raising serious questions about how our veterans are treated by law enforcement. The screen cut to body camera footage I'd never seen before, showing a rain-soaked intersection at night. The timestamp read October 15th of the previous year, and the camera belonged to Officer Blake Richardson. He was responding to a traffic accident on University Avenue, the same street where he'd tased me a year later. Unit 47 responding to injury accident, University and 5th, Richardson's voice said over the radio. Looks like a head-on collision, possible fatalities. The accident was bad. A drunk driver had crossed the center line and slammed into a compact car carrying a young family. Richardson's partner, Officer David Chen, was first on scene and had immediately started trying to extract a trapped child from the back seat of the mangled vehicle, but the car was unstable, balanced precariously on its side, and Chen couldn't get the leverage he needed to free the kid. That's when I appeared in the frame. I was different then, cleaner, more put together, wearing the uniform of a private security company I'd worked for briefly. The timestamp showed it was just past midnight, and I was probably heading home from a late shift when I came across the accident scene. Without hesitation, I'd stopped to help. "Sir, you need to stay back," Richardson called out. "This is an active emergency scene." But I was already moving toward the overturned car, assessing the situation with the kind of tactical awareness that comes from years of operating in dangerous environments. On the footage, you could see me talking to Chen, pointing at the trapped child, gesturing toward the car's structural weak points. "I've got experience with extractions," I told Chen, my voice calm and professional. "If we can get a fulcrum point here and here, we can stabilize the vehicle long enough to get the kid out." What happened next was something I'd almost forgotten about until I saw it played back on television. Using a combination of military extraction techniques and good old-fashioned determination, Chen and I had worked together to free that trapped child. The footage showed me crawling into the wreckage, my uniform getting torn and bloody as I maneuvered through twisted metal to reach the scared kid. "It's okay, buddy," I was saying to the boy, my voice gentle despite the chaos around us. "We're going to get you out of here, I promise. What's your name?" "Tyler," the kid whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of sirens and radio chatter. "Okay, Tyler. I'm Marcus. I want you to grab my hand and hold on tight, okay? We're going to play a game where we crawl through this car like it's a tunnel. Can you do that for me?" The extraction took 20 minutes of careful, dangerous work. The car could have shifted at any moment, crushing both of us, but I couldn't leave that kid trapped in there. Chen provided stability from outside while I worked to free Tyler from his seatbelt and guide him through the wreckage to safety. When we finally got the boy out, he was banged up but alive. Paramedics immediately took over his care while Chen and I stood there breathing hard and bleeding from a dozen cuts. That's when Richardson approached us, his body camera capturing everything. "Outstanding work," Richardson told Chen, clapping him on the shoulder. "You saved that kid's life." Chen shook his head, still catching his breath. "Wasn't me, Blake. This guy did the heavy lifting. I couldn't have gotten Tyler out without him." Richardson turned to me, and for the first time in the footage, I got a good look at his face. He was younger than I'd remembered, less experienced, still carrying himself with the confidence of someone who hadn't yet learned that the world was full of situations his training hadn't prepared him for. "What's your name?" he asked. "Marcus Rodriguez. I was just driving by and saw the accident." "Military background?" "Army Rangers. Did 3 tours in Afghanistan." Richardson nodded, respect clear in his voice. "Well, Marcus Rodriguez, you just saved a kid's life. Chen's got 2 kids of his own, and I know their families are going to want to thank you personally." The footage continued for a few more minutes, showing paramedics loading Tyler into an ambulance, while his parents, who'd arrived from another hospital where they'd been visiting Tyler's grandmother, tearfully thanked everyone involved in the rescue. The boy's father, a big guy in his 40s with calloused hands and paint-stained work clothes, grabbed me in a bear hug that lifted me off my feet. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, tears streaming down his face. "Tyler's all we got. If something had happened to him—" "No thanks necessary," I told him. "Just hug your boy and be grateful he's okay." Richardson's body camera had captured the entire interaction, including the part where Chen gave me his personal business card and told me to call if I ever needed anything. "Seriously, man. Anything. You name it, and it's yours." The news story continued with an interview with Tyler's parents, now a year older and still grateful for what had happened that night. Tyler himself appeared on camera, a healthy 13-year-old who wanted to thank the man who'd pulled him from the wreckage. "I remember being really scared and thinking I was going to die," Tyler said, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of his words. "Then this man crawled into the car and told me everything was going to be okay. He saved my life and now he's in trouble? That doesn't seem right." The reporter then cut to an interview with Chen, who was clearly upset about what had happened to me. He was older than Richardson, maybe mid-40s, with the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen enough human misery to last several lifetimes. "Marcus Rodriguez is a genuine hero," Chen said, his voice tight with controlled anger. He risked his life to save a child, asked for nothing in return, and now he's being treated like a criminal because he had a medical emergency. It's bullshit, and I'm not afraid to say so on camera. The story concluded with questions about police training for mental health situations and the treatment of veterans in the criminal justice system. The reporter mentioned that the Riverside Police Department had declined to comment on the case beyond stating that Officer Richardson had acted appropriately, given the information available at the time. My phone started ringing before the story was even over. Janet Kowalski called first, her voice more animated than I'd ever heard it. "Marcus, have you seen the news? This changes everything. We need to talk immediately." Then Sarah called, and for the first time since the divorce, she sounded like the woman I'd married instead of the adversary I'd been battling for years. "Marcus, I saw the story. Emma saw it too. We need to talk." I think I've made some mistakes. By the next morning, the story had exploded across social media. The hashtag #JusticeForMarcus was trending locally, and veteran advocacy groups were sharing the body camera footage with captions like, "This is how we treat our heroes." The contrast between Marcus the hero and Marcus the criminal was stark enough to give anyone whiplash. Richardson's social media accounts, which had been set to public, were flooded with comments from people demanding answers. Why hadn't he recognized me from the previous year? How could he treat someone who'd saved his partner's life like a dangerous criminal? The Riverside Police Department was forced to issue a statement promising a full review of the incident. But the real game changer came when Officer David Chin decided he'd had enough of watching his hero get railroaded by the system. He showed up at my motel room on Thursday morning, still in uniform, looking like a man with something important to say. "Marcus," he said when I opened the door, "we need to talk, and you need to see this." He had a laptop with him, loaded with additional body camera footage from the night of the accident. Footage that hadn't made it into the news story, showing what happened after the immediate emergency was over. Richardson and Chen had given me a ride back to my car, talking about everything from military service to the challenges of police work in small cities. "You ever think about joining the force?" Richardson had asked during that ride. "We could use more guys with your background and experience." "Thanks, but I don't think I'm cut out for law enforcement," I'd replied. "Too much politics, too many rules. I prefer situations where the good guys and bad guys are easier to identify." Richardson had laughed at that, a genuine sound of amusement and camaraderie. "Yeah, I hear you. But the offer stands if you ever change your mind. The department needs more people who actually give a shit about helping others." Chen showed me other footage too, additional angles from different officers' cameras that revealed details I'd forgotten. The careful way I'd monitored Tyler's vital signs while we worked to extract him. The professional assessment I'd given about vehicle stability and extraction options. The calm, competent way I'd handled a dangerous situation that could have killed both the child and me. "Blake doesn't remember any of this," Chen told me, his voice heavy with disgust. "Or he's pretending not to remember. Either way, it's not right. You saved a kid's life, and a year later, the same department treats you like garbage because you had a medical emergency." "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked. "The trial's over. I've already been convicted." "Because the trial's not really over," Chen said. "There's going to be an internal investigation, probably a federal civil rights investigation too. This body camera footage is going to be evidence that Richardson knew exactly who you were and what kind of man you are. The department is going to have to answer some very uncomfortable questions." He was right. By Friday, the FBI had opened a preliminary investigation into whether my civil rights had been violated during the arrest and prosecution. The body camera footage showing Richardson's interaction with me the previous year had raised questions about whether he'd deliberately ignored my veteran status and history of heroic action when filing his report. The Riverside Police Department placed Richardson on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. The district attorney's office announced they were reviewing my conviction to determine whether prosecutorial misconduct had occurred, and Tyler's parents hired a civil rights attorney to explore filing a federal lawsuit on my behalf. What Officer Richardson did to Marcus was inexcusable, Tyler's father told reporters. This man saved our son's life, and a year later the same police department treated him like a criminal. It's wrong, and somebody needs to be held accountable. The dominoes started falling fast after that. Channel 7 did a follow-up story featuring interviews with other veterans who'd had negative interactions with Richardson over the years. A pattern emerged of an officer who seemed to have little patience for people experiencing mental health crises, especially veterans whose behavior didn't fit his narrow definition of normal. One story particularly stood out. 6 months before my incident, Richardson had arrested a homeless Marine veteran named James Murphy for aggressive panhandling outside a grocery store. Murphy had been having a PTSD episode triggered by 4th of July fireworks, and Richardson had interpreted his confused behavior as threatening. Murphy spent 3 days in jail before a veteran advocacy group posted his bail, and he'd left town shortly after, rather than fight charges he couldn't afford to contest. I tried to explain that I was a veteran, that I was having problems because of the fireworks, Murphy told the reporter, but Officer Richardson just kept saying I was a danger to families with children. He acted like being a veteran made me more dangerous, not less. The FBI investigation moved quickly, probably because the evidence was so clear-cut. Richardson's body camera from the accident scene proved that he knew exactly who I was and what I'd done to help his partner. His failure to mention any of this in his report about our encounter suggested either deliberate omission or criminal negligence in the performance of his duties. More importantly, the investigation revealed that Richardson had accessed my military records through police databases after the accident, learning details about my service history and decorations. He'd known I was a decorated combat veteran when he tased me in that parking lot, and he'd chosen to characterize me as a dangerous vagrant anyway. Federal prosecutors don't mess around when it comes to civil rights violations, especially when they involve veterans and police misconduct. By December, Richardson was facing federal charges for deprivation of rights under color of law, a felony that could send him to prison for 10 years. The local district attorney dropped all charges against me and issued a public apology, calling my prosecution a miscarriage of justice based on incomplete information. Judge Hernandez vacated my conviction in a brief hearing that drew a packed courtroom full of veterans, civil rights activists, and reporters. She was clearly uncomfortable with the situation, acknowledging that the court had been misled by incomplete and potentially fraudulent police reports. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said from the bench, "the court offers its sincere apology for the injustice you've suffered. Your conviction is hereby vacated and all associated penalties are dismissed. While this doesn't undo the harm you've experienced, I hope it represents a step toward the justice you deserve." The apology felt good, but it couldn't give me back the months of stress, the custody battle, the lost job, or the reputation damage I'd suffered. Some things can't be fixed with legal procedures and official statements, but it was a start, and for the first time in months, I felt like maybe the system could work for people like me instead of against us. The civil rights lawsuit moved forward with Tyler's family as the primary plaintiffs and me as a supporting witness. The case wasn't really about money, though the financial settlement would certainly help, but about sending a message that veterans deserved better treatment from the people sworn to protect and serve their communities. Richardson's attorney tried to argue that his client had acted in good faith based on the information available to him at the time, but the body camera footage made that defense impossible to maintain. The evidence clearly showed that Richardson had known exactly who I was and had chosen to treat me like a criminal anyway. The trial was a media circus, with veteran advocacy groups holding rallies outside the courthouse and civil rights organizations calling for nationwide police reform. Richardson took the stand in his own defense, claiming that he'd simply forgotten about our previous interaction and hadn't connected the heroic security guard from the accident scene with the erratic individual he'd encountered in the parking lot. It was a high-stress situation, he testified. Mr. Rodriguez was acting aggressively, and I responded according to my training. I had no intention of targeting him because of his veteran status. But the prosecutor destroyed that explanation with video evidence showing Richardson accessing my military records multiple times in the weeks following the accident. Computer logs proved that he'd viewed my service history, decorations, and even my home address, information that would have been fresh in his memory when he encountered me in the parking lot. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the federal prosecutor said during closing arguments, "Officer Richardson didn't forget about Marcus Rodriguez. He chose to ignore what he knew about Rodriguez's character and service record because it was easier to see him as a dangerous vagrant than as a decorated war hero having a medical emergency." The jury took less than 2 hours to return a guilty verdict on all charges. Richardson was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison and permanently barred from working in law enforcement. The Riverside Police Department settled the civil lawsuit for $2.3 million and agreed to implement new training protocols for interactions with veterans experiencing mental health crises. The money was nice, but the real victory was the policy changes that came out of the case. Police departments across California began requiring officers to receive specific training on recognizing and responding to veteran PTSD episodes. The legislation that emerged from my lawsuit, called Tyler's Law after the boy I'd helped rescue, mandated that all California police officers receive 40 hours of mental health crisis training with special emphasis on combat trauma. Richardson's conviction sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities nationwide. Here was an officer who'd been convicted of federal civil rights violations for tasing a veteran who'd previously saved his partner's life. The case became a touchstone for discussions about police accountability and the treatment of veterans in the criminal justice system. I used part of the settlement money to start a nonprofit organization called Second Chances, focused on providing legal assistance to veterans who'd been mistreated by the system. We partnered with the VA to create a rapid response team that could intervene when veterans were arrested for behavior related to service-connected disabilities. Within 2 years, we'd helped over 300 veterans avoid wrongful prosecution. Tyler's family became close friends. Practically adopted family, really. His parents, Mike and Jennifer Morrison, insisted on including me in birthday parties, holidays, and family celebrations. Tyler started calling me Uncle Marcus, and seeing him grow into a confident teenager was like watching a personal miracle unfold. "You know what the funny thing is?" Tyler told me during his high school graduation party. "I probably wouldn't be alive to graduate if you hadn't been there that night. And then when all that stuff happened with the police, it felt like the world was trying to punish you for being a good person. I'm glad everybody finally figured out the truth." Emma's custody situation resolved itself naturally once the truth came out. Sarah dropped her objections to joint custody and actually apologized for doubting me during the legal nightmare. Our relationship would never be what it was during our marriage, but we found a way to co-parent effectively and put Emma's needs ahead of our personal issues. "I was scared," Sarah admitted during one of our first civil conversations in years. "I saw the arrest, the conviction, and I thought maybe I'd been wrong about who you really were. But watching you handle everything with such dignity, seeing how the community rallied around you, I remembered why I fell in love with you in the first place." Emma, now 14 and wise beyond her years, had watched the entire saga unfold with the kind of mature perspective that made me proud and heartbroken at the same time. She'd had to grow up fast, dealing with adult problems that no kid should have to understand. But she'd also learned lessons about justice, perseverance, and standing up for what's right. "Dad," she said during one of our weekend camping trips, "when kids at school ask me about what happened with the police, I tell them you're a hero who had a bad day. Is that okay?" "That's perfect, sweetheart. That's exactly right." The ripple effects of the case continued for years. Richardson served his sentence and disappeared from public life, but his conviction became case law cited in police misconduct trials across the country. The body camera footage of me saving Tyler became part of police training curricula, used to teach officers about the difference between perception and reality when dealing with civilians in crisis. Jen was promoted to sergeant and eventually became head of the department's crisis intervention team. He'd call me every year on the anniversary of Tyler's accident, not to talk about the legal aftermath, but to check in on how I was doing and to remind me that good people still existed in law enforcement. "You changed everything for us," he told me during one of those calls. "Not just because you saved Tyler, but because you showed us that we could do better. The department's different now, more focused on helping people instead of just enforcing rules." That's your legacy, brother. The warehouse fired me, but within a month I had 3 job offers from companies who'd read about the case and wanted to hire someone with my background and integrity. I chose a position with a veteran-owned security firm that specialized in protecting corporate executives and high-value targets. The pay was 4 times what I'd been making loading trucks, and the work gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since leaving the Army. 5 years later, I'm the regional manager for the company, overseeing security operations across Southern California. We employ over 200 veterans, providing good jobs and career advancement opportunities for people who understand the value of service and sacrifice. It's not the life I'd planned when I was 22 and bulletproof, but it's a good life built on helping others while helping myself. Tyler Morrison is 19 now, a freshman at USC studying emergency medicine. He wants to be a paramedic, inspired by the first responders who saved his life that night. He still calls me Uncle Marcus, and we still get together for family dinners where Jennifer Morrison cooks too much food and Mike Morrison insists on telling the same stories about his son's rescue for anyone who'll listen. "You know what I remember most about that night?" Tyler told me recently. "It wasn't being scared or hurt. It was your voice telling me everything was going to be okay. You sounded so sure, so confident, that I believed you completely. That's what I want to do for other people someday." Richardson got out of federal prison after serving 14 months and moved to another state. I heard through the grapevine that he was working as a private security guard somewhere in Nevada, probably dealing with the same kind of professional limitations that follow a federal conviction. I don't wish him any particular harm, but I don't lose sleep over his situation either. Actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences last longer than we'd like. The Riverside Police Department underwent significant reforms in the years following the case. New leadership, better training, and a culture shift toward community policing rather than aggressive enforcement. They even named their crisis intervention unit after Tyler Morrison, a reminder that police work at its best is about protecting the most vulnerable members of society. Emma graduated high school last year and is studying criminal justice at Cal State San Bernardino. She wants to be a police officer, which initially terrified me given our family's history with law enforcement. But she's smart and thoughtful, and determined to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. "I want to be the kind of cop who helps people like you, Dad," she told me when she announced her major. "I want to make sure what happened to you never happens to anyone else." I couldn't argue with that. The world needs more people willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult or dangerous. Emma's got that instinct naturally, and I'm proud to have played a small role in nurturing it. The Second Chances organization grew beyond what I'd ever imagined possible. We've helped over 1,000 veterans navigate legal challenges related to their service-connected disabilities, partnering with law schools to provide free legal representation and working with police departments to improve their mental health response protocols. The work is challenging and sometimes heartbreaking, but it gives meaning to everything I went through. Last month, we received a letter from a Marine veteran in Texas whose charges were dropped after his attorney cited my case as precedent. He'd been arrested during a PTSD episode triggered by construction noise that sounded like incoming artillery, and the responding officers had used my case as a template for recognizing and properly responding to combat-related mental health crises. "Your story probably saved my life," he wrote. "Not just because it kept me out of prison, but because it showed me that even the worst situations can lead to something positive if you're willing to fight for what's right. Thank you for showing the rest of us What courage looks like. The anniversary of Tyler's accident has become an informal holiday for everyone involved. The Morrison family hosts a barbecue every October 15th, bringing together the first responders, medical personnel, and family members who were part of that night. It's a celebration of life and second chances, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes. This year's gathering was bigger than usual, with Tyler home from college and Chen's kids, now teenagers themselves, helping with the cooking. Richardson wasn't invited, obviously, but his absence was more notable for what it represented than any lingering animosity. We'd all moved beyond that chapter of our lives, focusing on building something positive rather than dwelling on past injustices. "You know what I learned from all this?" I told the crowd during an impromptu speech near the end of the evening. "I learned that sometimes you have to go through hell to find out who you really are and what you're really capable of. I learned that good people will stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. And I learned that the worst day of your life might just be the beginning of the best chapter." Tyler raised his glass of soda in a toast. "To Uncle Marcus," he said, "who taught us that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear handcuffs and keep fighting anyway." The legal system worked, eventually. Justice was served, even if it took longer than anyone would have liked. But the real victory wasn't the money or the conviction or the policy changes, though all of those mattered. The real victory was proving that good people can overcome bad situations when they're willing to stand together and fight for what's right. I still have PTSD. I still have bad days when certain sounds or smells transport me back to places I'd rather forget. But I also have a support system now, a community of people who understand that mental illness isn't a character flaw and that asking for help isn't a sign of weakness. I have a job that pays well and provides meaning, a relationship with my daughter that's stronger than ever, and a sense of purpose that goes beyond just surviving day to day. Most importantly, I learned that my worst moment didn't define me. Getting tased in a parking lot while having a PTSD episode was humiliating and traumatic and unfair, but it wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where I got to use my experience to help other people avoid the same kind of injustice. Richardson probably learned some lessons too, though I doubt he'd admit it publicly. Sometimes the people who need to change the most are the ones least likely to acknowledge their mistakes. But the system changed around him, and that's what really matters. Future officers will receive better training, future veterans will be treated with more understanding, and future Tyler Morrisons will have better people responding when their world turns upside down. The body camera footage that exposed the truth is now part of police training programs nationwide, used to teach officers about the importance of treating every interaction with dignity and respect. Richardson's conviction serves as a cautionary tale about what happens when law enforcement officers let personal bias override professional judgment. And Tyler Morrison, now 19 and studying to save lives just like his life was saved, carries forward the lesson that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. He knows that heroes come in all shapes and sizes, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought in parking lots and courtrooms rather than battlefields. The kid I pulled from that wreckage 5 years ago is going to be a paramedic, and someday he'll probably save somebody else's life. When he does, he'll remember that night when a stranger crawled into twisted metal to pull him to safety, and he'll understand that help can come from the most unexpected places. That's how it works. One act of courage inspiring another, creating ripples that spread outward until they change the entire landscape. Every day I wake up grateful for the chance to keep fighting the good fight, to stand up for veterans who need advocates, to show my daughter what it means to turn adversity into opportunity. The taser hurt, the legal battle was hell, and the public humiliation nearly broke me. But it also led me to a life with more purpose and meaning than I'd ever imagined possible. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what really matters. Sometimes you have to hit rock bottom to discover how high you can climb. And sometimes the worst thing that ever happens to you turns out to be the best thing that ever happens to everyone around you. That's the truth. They don't teach you in basic training or war college or any of the other places where they prepare you for combat. They teach you to survive enemy fire and improvised explosives and all the obvious dangers that come with wearing your country's uniform in hostile territory. But they don't teach you how to survive coming home, how to navigate a civilian world that doesn't understand what you've seen and done, how to find meaning and purpose when the mission is over and the enemy is your own broken psyche. I figured it out, though. We all do, eventually, if we're lucky and stubborn and willing to accept help from unexpected sources. The trick is remembering that every day above ground is a good day, that every sunrise is another chance to make things better, and that the people who matter most are the ones who stick around when everything goes to hell. Tyler Morrison is alive today because I happened to be driving down University Avenue at the right moment 5 years ago. My life is better today because a good cop named David Chen decided that justice mattered more than loyalty to a bad partner. Emma Rodriguez is growing up to be an amazing young woman because she learned that her father's worst moment doesn't define his character. And somewhere in Nevada, Blake Richardson is probably learning that reputation takes years to build and seconds to destroy, that authority without accountability is just tyranny with a badge, and that the people you hurt on the way up are the same people you meet on the way down. The circle completes itself, eventually. Justice might be slow, but it's persistent. And heroes don't always wear uniforms or badges or capes. Sometimes they're just ordinary people who decide to do the right thing when it matters most, even when nobody's watching, even when it costs them everything they thought they wanted. That's the story they'll tell about Marcus Rodriguez someday, when I'm gone and Emma's telling her own children about their grandfather who crawled into a burning car to save a stranger and got tased by a cop for having bad memories on a Tuesday morning. It's not the story I would have written for myself, but it's the story I got, and I'll be damned if I'm not going to make it count for something. The epilogue is still being written, day by day, choice by choice, act of courage by act of courage. And every morning when I wake up and put on my uniform, a different kind of uniform now, but a uniform nonetheless, I remember that I'm still fighting for something that matters. I'm still serving my country, just in a different way. And I'm still that kid from East LA who signed up to make a difference in the world, even if the world turned out to be more complicated than anyone told me it would be. Some stories end with everything tied up in a neat bow, all conflicts resolved, and all characters learning their lessons like a heartwarming TV movie. This story ends with the understanding that real life is messier than fiction, that justice is a process rather than a destination, and that the best outcomes often come from the worst circumstances if you're willing to keep fighting when fighting seems hopeless. Officer Richardson learned that actions have consequences. Tyler Morrison learned that heroes come in unexpected packages. Emma Rodriguez learned that her father's strength comes not from never falling down, but from always getting back up. And I learned that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is exactly what needs to happen to become the person you were meant to be. The truth has a way of surfacing, eventually. Body cameras don't lie. Federal investigations don't miss details, and communities don't tolerate injustice when they're presented with clear evidence of right and wrong. It took longer than I would have liked, cost more than I could afford, and hurt worse than any physical wound I'd received in combat. But it worked out in the end, the way things usually do when good people refuse to accept easy answers to complicated problems. That's the lesson Tyler Morrison will carry with him when he starts saving lives as a paramedic. That's the wisdom Emma Rodriguez will bring to her career in law enforcement. And that's the legacy I'll leave behind when my tour of duty on this earth finally comes to an end. Not just the life I saved in a car accident, but the changes that rippled out from one moment of courage in a parking lot, spreading across communities and generations until they became part of something larger than any one person's story. Every veteran has a moment when they realize their service didn't end when they took off the uniform. Mine came in a courtroom when Judge Hernandez vacated my conviction and acknowledged that justice had been served. Not because I'd been vindicated, but because the system had learned from its mistakes and committed to doing better for the next guy who needed help instead of handcuffs. The fight continues every day in ways both large and small. Every veteran we help at second chances, every police officer who receives proper training, every family that doesn't have to watch their hero get treated like a criminal. That's all part of the same mission we started when we raised our right hands and swore to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Sometimes the enemies are overseas, wearing different uniforms and speaking different languages. Sometimes they're closer to home, wearing badges and carrying tasers and making assumptions about people they don't understand. Either way, the mission remains the same. Stand up for what's right, protect those who can't protect themselves, and never surrender to the forces that would make this world a little darker and a little less hopeful. Richardson's body camera captured the moment I saved his partner's life, but it also captured the moment he chose to forget that service when it became inconvenient. That choice cost him his career, his freedom, and his reputation. My choice, to crawl into a burning car for a kid I'd never met, led to everything that followed, both the nightmare and the redemption. We all make choices every day, and those choices define us more than our circumstances ever could. The choice to help or walk away. The choice to tell the truth or convenient lies. The choice to stand up or stay silent when someone needs an advocate. Blake Richardson made his choices, and I made mine, and the rest is history written in federal court records and body camera footage and the grateful smile of a kid who grew up to save other people's children. That's how you know a story has a good ending. Not because everything works out perfectly, but because the people who needed to learn something learned it. The people who needed help got it, and the people who needed justice received it, even if it took longer than anyone wanted. The rest is just details, and details fade with time. What remains is the truth, and the truth is that good people doing good things will always triumph over bad people doing bad things, as long as someone's willing to shine a light in the darkness and demand that the system live up to its promises. The body camera doesn't lie. Justice might be slow, but it's inexorable. And heroes aren't born. They're made, one choice at a time, in moments when nobody's watching and everything's on the line. Sometimes you find out you're a hero by accident, and sometimes you find out by getting tased in a parking lot. Either way, the important thing is what you do with that knowledge once you have it. I'm still here, still fighting, still serving in my own way. And every morning when I wake up, I remember that kid trapped in twisted metal and the promise I made to get him out safely. Some promises you keep even when keeping them costs everything you thought you had. Some fights you win even when you lose everything else. And some stories have endings that are really just beginnings, if you're brave enough to see them that way.